right, so should we do it? We got a couple of veterans, a couple of people who are new to it. That applies to both the book and also Interintellect Salon. So this is the first time I've tried to do a big like book thing. So if there's things that can shift or change or that would feel better, like let's just redesign anything to make it work well. I was thinking, maybe we dive in and just sort of start with thinking about the way that the text opens with that first line, just to be a little bit bookish for a second, about the baby being born and the baby being sort of foretold in this way, right? That like the grandfather comes in and announces this. And then we don't get back to like this kid for 70 pages, And so there's this like huge gap of time where you're like, cool, cool, prophesied child of some great kind. And then actually we're going to back like way, 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 way up to talk about the geography, right? The kind of the terroir of the hill country. So I thought maybe we could just start there and like linger in that space since that's what the author seems to want us to do as well. Thoughts, observations, things we should put into the collective pot of thinking. What strikes you? I can like riff all day on things, so I always want to be careful to not feel like a dominant player, but I'm also happy to throw things out if that feels better.
I thought it was sort of interesting in that the geography obviously plays a huge part in the kind of economic downfall of Rose Johnson's in terms of it's just unviable, but it's in a state they don't know and sort of almost can't be aware of. It's like kind of walking into the disaster of a whole trap type thing, and but it's one you sort of I know you kind of have to have some sympathy with them at first, just because it seems like a sort of paradise on Earth, which kind of just rapidly collapses around them. But and then I think it's so important for sort of Lyndon Johnson's story and just that he has this whole kind of burning seed within him, a sort of discontent with how it's his family and all that life has sort of turned out, that he's in this kind of back end of nowhere, which seemed promising when way back in the day they all sort of came, but it's turned into this just a sort of hellhole almost. It's just, but it's important for his psychology, I think. And
Yeah, I think the value of like planting that, like he's got the conviction. Like maybe his dad and his grandpa picked a wrong direction to have conviction in and stuck it out. But it really plants that seed of this guy's gonna do whatever it takes. And thankfully for him, he picked a more fruitful direction that success was possible. But it kind of like the further in you get, the more you see, because he just the energy he has and the drive, like you kind of see that coming from historical his family stuff. So
Marcus writes in, just love the visual of the settlers leaving and riding GTT, right, gone to Texas on their gates. Amazing, not only how much people will pack up and move their whole lives for a new opportunity, but also how long they'll hang around and wait out a bad situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really struck by the metaphor of the trap and the idea that the people who moved there were walking into this life where your fortunes could turn so quickly, just these ra riches to rags stories. Um, Quite remarkable and really a contrast with the way a lot of, I would say most of America is now much more cautious and much more risk averse than it was then. That that the idea that somebody could be just high in power, high in wealth one day, one year, and then a year later just completely busted, right? That's remarkable. And this seemed to happen. That happened to the Johnson family, multiple times in different decades. But that it seems to be reflected in the nature of the land too.
So
That
we've got a
it
kind of like geography as destiny set up against the burning character filled with ambition and desire, and then all of these kind of unfruitful paths that his predecessor that he almost gets a chance to sort of learn from his predecessors or like witness. But it makes, I don't know, like that it almost feels like it sets up this drama like, will the geography fundamentally win, right? Is like human agency capable of escaping the structures of the landscape, and then running through it like a kind of recurrent theme of this, what it takes to keep thinking things could be otherwise, what kinds of personalities or what kinds of psychologies or proofs do you need to think that what's right in front of your eyes is going to last, and that what's right in front of your eyes isn't going to last, and maybe could even be better or different. Like, I don't know, do we get clues that we might want to pull in about that layer of the personalities or psychologies?
I guess I was just kind of wondering a lot about like Caro's choices, kind of his selection in all of this. I mean, on the one hand, it's like um, it's kind of a great, kind of cinematic, rip-roaring story, right? With the people he picks. But obviously, and some of it may have been like just what the best stories were or who he had evidence for. But of course, he's only really tracing certain strains of the family. And I wonder to what extent that's because it's obviously there's this whole he's a button thing that was, at birth that you see in the physical resemblance and everything. And I think in the first two pages, he like repeats that name like 20 times or something. It's crazy how like he's just hammering that in. Um, but I wonder how much he's trying to kind of cast. It's almost this inevitability, right? Like kind of mythical thing that Johnson is going to be coming from them, their stories, or he has their sort of character or their whatever tragic fate, as opposed to different chains of the family. So it was really interesting to me to kind of like think about um, why is he focusing on these ones and not others, and all of it sort of seems so kind of like teleological, like it all has to build up to Johnson and what everything's going to be happening in his life. And I didn't know if I should take that at face value or if that's like partially kind of an agenda because of his view on Johnson. And so that's why we're focusing on these parts of the family and their stories.
Yeah, Amy adds in the hero story is big on bloodlines and destiny, but LBJ's story was based on failure on one side of the family bloodline. So, like, what do you do if you're picking strains, even if you want to kind of like load the deck towards the mythic, which sure does seem like Caro's flirting pretty hard with that kind of hagiography, and telos. But then you have to account for these like repeated failures. Like, does that make the strain a good strain or a bad strain? Like, it's hard to predict what's going to come out of the next like combination of a strain that seems to rise and fall so much, you know so we've got like maybe something in the like the ground, the architecture, the strains, which seems like a real hereditary invitation to think about the the setup here of what makes LBJ's life possible. And what else? Anything else with the personality or psychology of those regions that feels like it feeds that stream of the ground?
I like the I like the fact that in these opening pages, the focus on the Buntons, and then later just a few pages later, the fact that the Buntons were smart enough not to move on into the hill country. So they were successful. The Johnsons weren't. They were lured into it. So you know what? I'm going to forget about the Buntons in another couple hundred pages, and certainly by the time we get to the end of the book. But for the first 40 or 50 pages, I thought it was really good storytelling and really, for me, enriched the depth of his psychology, thinking about, you know, he wasn't just a Johnson who was a great guy. He was a Johnson and a Button from a line of other great people, but maybe not as great as them, or maybe greater in, well, we'll see, greater in a different way. I don't remember President Bunton, but at the beginning, at least, I thought it was cool thinking about sort of the fall from grace of the Johnsons compared to the Buntons and how great they'd been. So I was glad Caro fleshed that out because he didn't have to. Over.
Right, right. And there's a little sleight of hand early with the Buntons, which I thought was super interesting, where we hear about the most remarkable Bunton, but then it turns out that the line that Johnson inherits from is the brother. Like there's just a real fast twist right there where it slides sideways. And I'm like, okay, what's the theory of siblinghood here? You know, is that variations on, right? Why this permutation? But he makes very light of it. He doesn't draw your attention to it. It's just suddenly it's not actually the same Bunton. Other things like that stood out. Right. So we've got the psychology in that sense. Anything else about the kind of personality or psychogeography, just because the historians will often play with that stuff, and not all will, but some do.
I like Mark. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I just have to.
Just seeing Marcus's comment as far as Phoenix, Arizona existing. And I think the Johnsons moving to the hill country, and then like down the line, LBJ's involvement in getting electricity out there. But just like the geography ties into like the type of person and group who would move there, and the stubbornness, and like the like shaking your fist at God a little bit. Like, no, screw you. We're going to make this work. So I think those two are like intertwined so deeply. Like, but then the failure of his father really planted the seed. Like he has something to prove, and that's a core driver from my perspective of his path leading out of it.
Jamie, did you want to say something?
Well, I was basically going to say almost the exact same thing, except maybe not quite as eloquently. But yeah, I think it's just kind of a stubbornness inherent in a family. Like Sam Johnson Sr. makes a fortune, loses a fortune, and then builds it slightly back up, and then goes back to do the same thing again, which is just kind of insane. And then Sam Johnson Jr. kind of buys a ranch for far too much, even though he doesn't like farming, and it's just for no particular reason apart from his name. But and for Lyndon Johnson, it's the whole he almost defies his parents just for no particular reason. Almost it's just because they said it, and so he can't kind of follow them, and he needs to almost be like broken at the end to finally be kind of accommodate even slightly to the end. So it's just this inherent strain of stubbornness. And Marcus talked about the whole going to Texas thing for sort of attracting those type of people, but it's like inherent throughout his family of generation after generation, just stubbornness, and it finally what took like 50 years for almost to one of them to kind of be accommodating more towards giving up almost of being so stubborn.
I was reading this while the Knicks were in the playoffs here, in New York, and I kept thinking somebody's got to do a book about the 50 years between the Knicks winning, in the 70s to here, where it's like what's this lineage story of the failures and the potential triumphs set against that backdrop. It was like it really is doing some of that work of telling us about a period of time. And I kept wondering, reading this, if you could almost start to feel the model working in his head of like, there's the rain line that really was there the whole time, almost like a perfect A-B conditions. Here's this like strain, and then here's this sort of seedlings and permutations. So on the balance, what of these dimensions is something that makes a difference in the population? And can you like somehow assay out what are the contingencies or like lines of the character so that we can really, really, really zoom in, almost like watching like a lab scientist or something do this work on the causality of like who gets to be the figure if we dismiss or start to set up all the other potential causes that could have led to this person being somehow like insufficiently individual enough to be able to tell this story, and it's like that sort of starts to feel like the model in my head as I read this from Caro, like he's thinking like the scientist with the populations and the strains. I don't know. Did you notice stuff like that? I always feel like I'm trying to imagine, how did the person make the choice to tell this kind of history? And
Well, it's striking that the biography starts so far before, we're 70 pages in before he's even born. And so you see some of his personality being shaped by events and people and the land itself over 100 years before he even exists, and how all of that has, some determination, has some effect on basically the personality he develops, stuff that he's not even privy to has an effect on his personality and his character over 100 years later.
I feel like that would be like mm, a bold move by a contemporary historian, like the idea that you could kind of zoom back 100 years and find causality in who people become would be really difficult to pull off in the present.
Well, I think it goes against how we view ourselves now in this day and age. But everything that happened seems so far removed from, the idea that soil fertility or the weather can shape who we are and our outcomes in life. We're so divorced from that now in the modern world.
Mhm.
Yet this is still, almost within living history, within, a lifetime or two of that being maybe the dominant factor on what people's prospects, what their life was like.
Yeah, I kind of like start to wonder, did he do the research and then it happened to line up well, so he included it? Or because that it didn't have to happen that way, or is it his telling that makes it line up well?
Do we have other historians in the group, amateur otherwise? So I'm gonna go out over my skis. So I just want to make sure, like, if this seems implausible, like if you feel like I'm stretching, please always let me know. But I felt a little bit like it was like watching someone have arguments with other schools of history, but like tuck them into the seams so that the narrative carried the weight. But he's like punching at other people and having fights with other schools of how you get to know what you know or what causality is, right? So you can feel a little bit of like the Annals school, like the big people who want to do longue durée history that has like become popular in mid 20th century, that are looking at geography as destiny, or these long arcs to explain social phenomena. Like you can feel that he's metabolized that era in a way that might not have been possible before, and so that felt foregrounded. It also has this little tuck in at the beginning where he spends all that time describing the bunting eye, the milky white magnolia skin. Like it's like so specific and tiny. I think that's like a kind of nod to the tradition of like Plutarch and the biographies of great men, who also uses this trope a lot, where it's like Alexander had hair unlike any other, and they say he glowed. It's almost like saintly and playing with the myth of the great man figure. And certainly, I mean, Caro would know that stuff, but he's almost like teeing it up so that then the question of like how you become who you become, or the scope of what kinds of evidence you use to put it forward, is making a little bit of a methodologist's argument, but in a pretty like low key way so that it doesn't stand out. But that would be my sense reading it. And then the other kind of tradition I was thinking of, but again, let me know if this feels like too much a stretch, was writers like Thucydides, right? Who like every historian's got to encounter at some point, writing about the Peloponnesian War, which is like, never fight a land war in Asia, don't get on too many fronts, right? There's a lot of Thucydides trap discourse in the present too. But that desire to decide, like, you weren't there for how any of it went down. So then what can you do to say, like, chances are it went down like this? Because is it eyewitnesses? Do you have hard evidence? Or is it like on the whole, the conditions are like this, so more or less it's going to kind of go this way. And as he's sort of flirting with some of that causality by starting early in the space of the mythic and the heroic as determining factors and letting them kind of have a little bit of drama on the page to I don't know, just to frame up, some of the stuff. I don't know if any of that feels a little too.
Well, he wants people to buy the book, so telling a good story. So.
I mean, that's true.
But
That's true.
the painting a picture with like the button eye and these other things really trails into like his analysis of the ranch layouts, like how far away the wells are, how many times. Like I really love like the mental picture he helps you paint with all the background. So not from a historian perspective, but like as a consumer, like that was pretty incredible.
Well, there was a line in there, and I might be getting it wrong, but it it said they looked at the match with a rancher's eye towards breeding, or something of that nature, and just how much focus there is on the breeding, on the ancestral lines that feed into the focus of the book.
Yeah, Amy sort of amplifies that by noting, I wonder if Caro starts with this legend version of his birth to make us feel a little sympathy for him up front. And Jamie, you kind of added, right? If so, writing about him as a teenager wasn't great for increasing the amount of sympathy for him, right? So now we get to the like, maybe if we have so much of this kind of setup on the strain and the matches, etc., then the inevitable. Happy Father's Day to anyone out here, right? The inevitable happens, like you're like teenagers, like the squeeze between generations that is like neither innocent enough for us to project upon nor responsible enough for us to totally let go of. And so maybe we should talk a little bit about just the setup, like who is this person now in the drama of the teenage years, and what is the world in that moment of formation and change. Teenager LBJ.
I think it was funny to
So,
me because it all seemed so modern to me, all the the wildness and the things like school dances. And I mean, I realize, of course, that those things happened 100 years ago, but I have uh I have young adult children. and and just sort of seeing that path of him coming to the realization that he wants to go to college after all. Um, the whole thing, all these sort of missteps and being wild and rebellious, uh, it just seems like such a modern rite of passage that he goes through. And to think that this is 100 years ago is sort of, and yet also, only a few short decades uh, after any white people even showed up there.
That's crazy.
Yeah, the imagery of I forget when in his life he got in a fight, but then rolling on his back and like whining is just so powerful. Like it really rips out like because it builds up your respect. Like okay, hard work, and then it's like, and then you try and talk yourself out of I was never in that point like in life, but then like okay, like he was a real person.
Marcus, were you gonna say something? Did I cut you off earlier?
yeah, I hope you guys can hear me. Um, but it felt like they're setting up sort of this like aristocratic frame, right? Sam comes out of the frontier and he's doing all this hard work, and later in the section when Lyndon is growing up, like they definitely grow up poor. They definitely grow up, having to work. But he has that thread of his father, is already in the legislature, and he spent a lot of time there as a child. So I feel like they're setting up like a little bit of difference between like the first generation frontier and second generation. So yeah, that thread of either poor frontier aristocracy is pretty interesting.
Poor frontier aristocracy is such a great phrase, you know, like we forget that there's like you're a second gen frontier, you know, it's like these rough, crazy conditions. So we have like the kid who uh does have some exposure for sure to like the legislature, a little bit of far away, right? Going to Austin, seeing how people say things in rooms. And the mom, who is like the only person with a college degree in the county, seems like a pretty exceptional situation and household for the teenager to grow up in. Other aspects of that kind of household situation or those years in their formation that stood out to you?
I was something that kind of had a hard time keeping up with was their level of wealth. Because when I thought they were broke, it's like he trades in his car, and the fact he had a car, I was like, um, I thought the car was long gone. Um, and then there were little other things before that, though. Um, what was it? The father stayed at the Driscoll, which isn't the Driscoll still there in Austin Hotel? Someone help me out. Okay, I thought so. Yeah, I thought it was
Still
like
on
the
Sixth
hotel.
Street.
Yeah.
The
Um, but they stayed at he stayed at the boarding house, which that reminds me of Congress. Uh, there's so many Congress people that will board up 3 and 4 and 5. I mean, they actually can have worse conditions than their legislative assistants and staffers and whatnot. Um, because and even some stay in their office. Actually, I worked with one who stayed in his office. Not when I was working for him. This was later, but still. Um, but anyway, back to the Johnsons, and they were there. It seemed like in the charity cases of them bringing them food, I can relate to that. Well, not my generation, much older. There would be ones that like there would be a daughter that got not left. She just ended up living a long time, and all of a sudden the money runs out, and she had either never worked, or if she did work or could work, it's like she's now 80 something, and can't walk up the stairs in her house type deal. So it's like charity, someone's bringing her, in this case, I'm thinking of my grandmother would bring her food daily for the last few years of her life type deal. Um, so I was kind of trying to picture them in that light, but then, but still the car came after that. And I was like, I don't know, maybe when they're both working on the road for the $2 a week, was it? Or one a day? It was a week. I
Two
can't remember.
dollars a day.
$2 a
I
day.
think
Thank
as
you.
a foreman, Sam earned 15 a week.
Okay. Okay. The 15 a week. Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe that did pay for the car. But anyway, I had a hard time keeping up with that, exactly what it meant and at what times.
I don't think it was a lot even then. I have this recollection that in the 1910s, I think the average wage was maybe $9 a week. So I don't think it was a really good wage.
Right. But if the average wage was 9 and you're at 15, you're still above, you're not, the one guy had to go to they didn't have grocery stores. What was it? The, what, whatever store they went to, and they named it. Like with $1 to spend, and it wasn't enough to buy anything for a family to eat. So I remember, so again, I was trying to place all these contexts, and the car just threw me. I was like, wait a
Right.
second,
Yeah.
car to
Broke
trade?
to me means not a no car. That's a good call
Yeah,
out. Yeah.
back then especially. And then
Hmm.
to trade it in,
Yeah.
like it, or did it say it was trading it up? Maybe I assumed they were trading it for a better car. But, and again, that threw me, and I'll quit babbling about that.
But it's great, right? Because it again, it's like what's going on. I mean, Paul, you kind of brought this up earlier too, when thinking about the structure of the narrative, like what's slipping here? What's driving the story? Like Caro's describing these sort of reversals of fortune, but it's very different if we're doing reversals of fortune between people who are like upper middle class to lower middle class versus like really the sort of safety net falling out fully underneath you and staying there, you know. And so what's Caro's sort of dramatization of what might not be so many class levels up and down? It kind
Yeah,
of question. Yeah.
I think I guess what's, part of it is probably just right, the conditions at the time, right? There was no safety net. And I think a lot of that is also kind of setting the ground maybe for not just his personality and how he'll develop in time, but also his politics, right? And so this is a world where um, obviously the hill country is like harder than some other places, but there were lots of parts of the country that was, isolated and people didn't have bathrooms. And Alec was mentioning before the electricity, but kind of the whole probably New Deal to Great Society project and just general economic development that's going to change that. But you can kind of see why LBJ might have sympathy and understanding for that, coming out of his personal experience and his father being a populist and all of that. But yeah, I guess in terms of the family's class, like it's interesting. I think some of that just goes with the time, right? Where people, but there is stuff he leaves out, like in an earlier generation, he's kind of talking about, I think, 1870s, 1880s, how much that generation was kind of suffering. And he doesn't mention that that was like a multi-decade depression in the US at the time, right? So some of it's their choices, but it's also just like an extremely hard time for everybody. Um, and then on their class, I do also feel like some of it is their choices, though, where they keep taking these kind of big swings, and it's like almost coming out of more of a desire to be, taking bets or risks to make it big, to be upper class, to be wealthy, and that's why it is so bad at times. Where I'm sure they were living amongst people, probably some of these more, stolid Germans in Fredericksburg or whatever, who just, minded their money and gradually built up wealth over time instead of like betting the farm or the ranch, I guess, literally, in these different generations to try to become like the big man in Central Texas. And then your family suffers for decades because of that.
Yeah, you get this real picture in the background of like Fredericksburg, the town they talk about being kind of the big like city in the area, a couple thousand people, but this kind of German immigrant community that has like the big rock buildings, the good masonry and like that. And that town is still a beautiful town, like the model of kind of communalisms and slow builds seemed very different than Johnson City down the road or some of these other kind of something between nothing and speculative boom and bust cycles that are driving the architecture of Central Texas, and so you just wonder. There was also this one other little thing I couldn't figure out what to do with, which was they keep describing the mom as someone who's like not scrimping, like she somehow doesn't have good home economics or something like it. And I kept thinking, I wonder what that part is supposed to be telling us. Like I understand the myth of like the son following dad around at the Capitol, dressing like him, moving like him. But what is it that's coming from the mom that return over and over again for Caro about class, household economics, psychic life, whatever, with the mom who's never quite on it and doesn't want to be about money? It's like a question of all this marginalia, like what are you trying to say about this woman, like just
Right.
say it, or like just I feel like you're trying to tell me something and I can't quite feel it yet.
My read on the mother was like she's like trying to hold some extra status, right? Like she's trying to hold status from where she came from, like not be like one of these, backwater hillbillies. So like it felt like she felt a little special, and I think that that's maybe what is being passed down to Linda is like you're special, you're a little bit, um, capable, or you deserve a little more maybe than all these people around you.
And she was also a little bit of a fish out of water in the hill country, and might have it, part of her influence might have been driving him to escape it rather than settle there. I mean, on the Johnson side, they left and came back. And so they constantly seem to be, drawn back to that area. Whereas his mother never quite fit in with the rest of the women there. She was still liked and admired, but she wasn't of that life and might have inspired him to drive his ambition outward.
Yeah, there's like this, there was this great passage on 55 where he just kept describing like her climbing all the hills, and looking into the landscape, and there's just like nothing. Even if you wanted there to be something, there would be nothing. And so she like felt like, I believe she's filled with loneliness and dread. And I kept thinking, wow, in a way, maybe like the trad wife of the present really needed network society to work, like to be trapped with no communication to other people in vast landscape must have been a very different way of experiencing the household, um, as a kind of piece of what she's holding as a clue. And then this desire to be elsewhere. I'm just thinking this now, like, it's this very specific kind of suffering if you feel like you're a fish out of water when you're around people because they're not somehow not like you, and also if even if you could go up, there would be nothing around to go to anyway, has got to feel like an incredibly intense experience of maybe like a claustrophobia or something like it. I mean, that has to have affected a kid growing up around it, because he almost feels, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, just trying to view it through that time's lens. Not that I have any, not that old, but like the town of 2,000 people, like getting together with somebody for coffee was their social media. Like that was the most stimulation you'd have. Like unless you really got into like when the cattle were birthing or something like that. But like our peaks of dopamine in these things, or artificial or real, are so much higher than they were, and constant. So just I tried to scale back that their existence was kind of a stimulation desert compared to ours anyway. So to me, it wasn't that big of a jump, but I do think maybe her like fish out of water existence might have influenced Lyndon to be more okay being the odd man out in future scenarios. Like maybe he saw it and took from it in that regard, and used it beneficially. Not that she necessarily used it beneficially in her existence from what we see, but kind of an interesting thought there.
Yeah, she seemed like she was trying to solve it almost like by becoming the town educator or something. Like, all right, if no one does this, then I'm going to change the soil, right? Like its own version of cultivation or something like it.
Right. And like locally, it was a peak. Like, but like if we scale it back out, like, okay, that's a blip, but making a change, yeah.
She's a local maxima, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Gravity attract, right. Yeah, it's painful to do. So we've got, the parents, the restlessness of the teenager then, and then the attempts that he makes to like escape the trap. What does he do and why doesn't it work? Or are there pieces that are gonna work, like, how do you get out? I haven't read this, so I'm sort of, yeah, since several people here have, like, he's clearly teeing up various patterns of strategy, so you probably see them in hindsight better than those of us who are new to the text will. Like, is there things we should be paying attention to that are early signs of strategic inclination?
I've got a little bit of a gap between him painting a picture of life in the country to like the little Congress, and him stealing his first election, in recollecting what
that there's going to be some thievery like in the election, maybe, maybe something's going on.
Spoiler alert. But
But you
No
can
kidding.
smell it coming. And yeah, John, sorry.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. What about, before we move too far off of the early pages, but this him trying to escape? I mean, let's remember what him toddling is, the toddler escapee too. Early on, there's something in the man that makes him want to walk away, makes him want to have people look for him, makes people want to miss him. As a toddler, as a teenager, as the kid between high school and college, as the boy leaving to go work somewhere or pretend to do some job and do something else. I was super happy that Caro teased out that early hiding in the haystack stuff, so that early on we could imagine him wanting to be found and people missing him when he was gone.
I,
Legacy. Yeah, sorry, Trey.
Tony may have been trying to say something there too. I'm not sure, but the thing about the haystacks and some of these stories, at one point toward the end of the reading, of this section of reading, I was just like, and it was only for a second there, and I wish I remember what triggered it, but I just got the perception that he might have been picking and choosing a little too much with what he was sharing, but at the same time he shares so much, it's like, how could he possibly have done that? And it was and again, it was only for a second, and I forget what it was. But then there was also something that's actually maybe tied with what I'm trying to say is he got to be a little too Freudian, and I was like, wait a second, a little too early for this. Let's wait, later in this book or later in one of the mini volumes that follow. And again, it wasn't very long. Probably just a few paragraphs, maybe even sentences, but think paragraphs. And I don't know, just had that feeling.
I mean, anytime you have like long passages about like your mother and your father, I feel like it's fair for us to like ask, we know we're working in the wake of kind of psychodynamics and, histories that are reaching to be told like that in the period. It seems fair to see the traces of it.
Before I forget, you brought up about being a historian, or asking if anybody was a historian. I think you said you weren't.
I'm a historian.
You are a
Yeah,
historian?
I'm
Okay.
a historian, yeah.
Okay. But you're asking if everybody else was one.
Yeah.
And it may it made me think of the sources he has going. And um I was wondering the timeline for this, which I need to go back and look, because I feel like he was able to talk to people before people may have been reluctant to talk, back when, because I think it's like with the internet over the last, quarter century, at some point people are like, wait, why are you asking these questions? A wall may have come up, but I'm guessing a lot of the people he talked to, and again, did he start this in the 90s? Is this book older than that? Is this an 80s?
I thought it was 82, but I'm
published.
not sure.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I think you're right. So we're talking the 70s. So forget this. Of course, they were willing to talk. Yeah.
I looked into when he first showed up, people were reluctant to talk. Like he and his wife actually bought a home there to say, we're serious about telling this story well. So just a little.
Yeah. I'm curious. Okay, that's very interesting. I just want to say I'm curious about that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add one bit and then go to Tony. It's a tricky thing to be a historian and work on the present like that, right? Where you have people, because like the best is when everything's done. You've got as much data as you can get. Other people could see the data if they wanted, right? And so then the goal is like, I've opened a new archive, but then, anyone could look. It's like having the ledger or something, and then you can interpret. And if you're working this close to the present, the legacy here still would have been unfolding, that kind of thing. And so we're often, I work close to the present like this. I work on kind of conservative and right-wing worlds. But it takes a lot longer. You start looking more like an anthropologist, where you have to do extended field work to build some bridges. And then the other piece you're often told is that you're not there to be a journalist, right? The job is not to charm and betray, like you're not trying to out someone. You're really trying to like do what you can to get people to talk to you, but there's not like a secret in the same way. So it's there's not a lot of people who do it because it's just a really time consuming, weird way to work. Just to add that. I'm sorry, Tony.
Oh no, I didn't have anything. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
But he's also racing a little bit so the people who have the stories aren't dying before he gets to them.
Yeah, John, did you want to say this or should I read it?
Oh, I was just commenting on the Freud, the question of whether it got Freudian, and I just noted that Caro sort of cautioned against looking at it that way. He said that Johnson was as hostile and defiant to his mother as he was to his father.
But then we get the other half of the strategy. So thinking about those teenage strategies again, that like maybe, I don't know if this is fair, Alec, maybe you can tell us. There's a lot of how he selects women, the being charming to women as pugilistic as he might be, he sure can charm the older women. And this kind of eye for like the local rich girl, in the room. So an awareness of the relationship between class, position, and the potential that a good mate can bind you to in terms of in debts that her family will show up for and deeper pockets to finance speculation. So I just something like that seemed to be working itself out too.
Yeah, I don't see him as strategic so much as opportunistic. I mean, he's not strategic. It could be said that opportunism is a strategy in itself, but he doesn't seem to have a plan. He just makes use of what he sees, and he's very good at scanning to see what opportunities there are.
Right? His father says that line like, you got to walk into a room and know who's with you and who's against you, but there's something about the vote being counted as a with you politically versus like who's the lady who's gonna she's
I
with
think
you. Yeah.
maybe it builds over time. Like earlier in life, he has the short horizon of being more opportunistic, like John was saying, but then over time, you see he builds layers into it and can see further into the distance and then applies that work ethic to, because I mean, to me, working in Congress sounds like the foothills, like a desolate place to get things done, but that's just who I am as a person. Like some people thrive in that space.
Well, and he says he wants to be, he says he, at a very young age, uh, in his childhood, and then again as a young congressman, he says he wants to be president. He doesn't have, he hasn't defined the way that he's going to get there, but he is clearly capable of it, right? So maybe a plan is not necessary.
Why do we think he says he wants to be president? Is it the power that it has? Is it his experience with his father at the legislator?
Such a great question, right?
Yeah, I never, it gets planted, but like I never come across any analysis to educate why. Just the biggest, boldest thing, possibly.
Yeah, I feel like I mean, growing up in just about every setting, there's always a kid or two in basically probably every school in America and every generation who's saying, I'm going to be president when I grow up. I think it's probably just a certain personality trait or attraction to being seen as the important person or the famous person or the powerful person or something like that.
And we haven't seen too much of this yet, but it just from what I know of him, not having read these before, and what's alluded to in the preface, he has a desire, an innate desire to dominate those he's around. He's not collaborative. He wants, and president is really the top you can aspire to.
Totally. I feel like that's educated by watching his dad being taken advantage of in different times and never ever wanting to feel that.
Yeah, I was struck by the passage where he, and it's like, I don't know how Caro can actually know this, but that you see the parents and all the other siblings have like genuine happiness, and Johnson, even as a boy, never betrays that. Like he's always disagreeable or can't let himself go to some extent, which I mean, might be an actual personality trait that people picked up on, I'm sure. But I mean, it's pretty amazing if you can kind of say that definitively. But it is an interesting insight to him. And then also, I mean, um, is that a reaction to what he saw with his father's frustrations and life being limited, or is that just like innate personality that he would have been someone who was always pushing for more regardless?
Yeah, I wonder what the big five would say about LBJ.
We totally need like posthumous big five tests. That would be amazing. Um, well, there's also that he just seems to want attention, right? That felt so like blunt, but I wonder if it's one of those things like the desire to be missed seems like someone who you could imagine getting roped to legacy concerns, like names on things, like faces on things, like this kind of there's some kind of driver some people seem to feel to glory and as monumentalized somehow. So maybe there's a needing to be missed. I don't know. Like that's a little speculation, but it seemed like Caro was setting us up to at least ask the question of motivation that Massimo raises. Jamie, you mentioned he went after the daughter, the woman his father had initially tried to marry. Mind us. There's like a slip there, right? On opportunism and strategy. Do you want to add anything?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think also he's living in a place called Johnson City after what a relative of his father's, when the whole ranch is being, it's like, I can't let Johnson Ranch go. There's a sort of huge, like, family thing of like kind of protecting the name, which is like, I mean, Johnson's kind of common name, so it's always, but throughout, there's like the family sort of remembering past times, like you're descending from Buntons and there's the mother from talking about like her past relatives. So there's a whole sort of like viewing themselves as better, and whereas like Lyndon didn't allow his sisters to dance with people he thought was common. So it's like a kind of view of himself as better than most people, or at least seems to be inherent in that, and like his family having been a sort of more noble type. And so I think the kind of aspiration to for him is just to show this thing, which is self-evident, that kind of he is someone people should like admire and be aware of. That's his kind of main goal in life.
Well, especially for the external persona,
Mm-hmm.
like some of the internal stories of like how he reacts when he's attacked or his pettiness and his like showing his belly is an interesting contrast. But yeah, his curated, polished, how people see him is so incredibly important to him.
Yeah, there was even like the going to California type thing where it's like the anecdote is he went to California when he was 17-ish and he pressed grapes and then he hitchhiked his way home, and then Caro sort of says what that is, and then it turns out none of that is true. He went and he worked in a law office, and then he got a ride back in a family friend. No, it would be a relations Buick, and it's like he has enough sort of stories of poverty in his life already that he doesn't kind of need to make it up, but he has to sort of make up this kind of idyllic one of uh, being poor and sort of working through it with a smile, even though that doesn't seem to be true at all.
Yeah. Trey, you've kind of got a bit like this as well, right? About the kind of weird timeline of like teenagehood, like in the extent, like how hard was teenagehood? How dominant for how long? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, that was with him starting college late, and then graduating early, but then he started following on the older kids early. It's like he went through all the phases of what I think a normal, maybe an 18-year-old gets one, and he had like three or four. Um, but that's just what I was like, I was trying to like teenage, because when I think of teenage years today, it feels like we stretch it out, but then teenage years 100 years ago, I'm like, well, they have to start early because, it's well, a little over 100 years ago. I'm in the 100 to what, 130 or whatever. I mean, it's like they can work, you've got to do it. Yet, he was what, worked for an attorney in California, comes back, works on the road. Uh, then after all that goes to college. Um, and again, it's like there's a little trouble trying to keep track of it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not as linear as we come to expect things today. Like the reality and also the story that's told by him, like keeping them straight. And then like to take a break during college to teach in a like mostly Spanish, mostly Mexican school along the border was an interesting another exposure to additional poverty. And I don't know have I don't know the exact range for what we're supposed to have read today, but is that within scope or is that a future?
Yeah.
But it's as far as educating like his perspective and movements in the civil rights movement down the line, like being tough on students so that the world will not be as hard on them if they're tougher type thing was also a very interesting storyline.
I think it's a great segue though for the piece we probably should also migrate in that seems like it's doing work here, which is the populism, the kind of properly political and
Yeah.
that's shaping,
Oh, I love the New Deal. The New Deal is great. Give me all your votes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we get to back up and starting with the father, get a really beautiful sensibility for an area of the country that is both innovating in terms of populist politics and the ecology of supporting potential media forms and institutions, and that's able to hold on to that impulse and transmit it a bit longer than some of the other areas where the land is perhaps a bit more fertile or the manufacturing conditions are a little better. So what did you make of the populism? I mean, we're so privileged to be reading this in the present when global populisms abound, after it's like a very fascinating way to encounter this material. But what'd you make of it?
Oh, hey, I could have done an entire salon on the populist party because like I really didn't know much about them, but like um especially in this like pre-telecom, pre-internet age, like the information in the market is just like such a valuable thing. And when they set up this alliance and they're trying to you know, set prices and bargain for equipment, and then the banks come in and start like crushing it. Like this, I don't know. I really, really got a sense of like America and democracy in this little battle because like yes, the bank has lots of money, um, and they can get laws, that advocate for their benefit, but like they're really coming in and saying like, hey, like we don't care what the laws are, like this is wrong, this is like unjust, right? So there's this huge disconnect between what the people on the ground feel is justice and what the law is saying is justice. And I don't know, like that battle just felt like sort of old as time, but it just felt really raw there in a way that like I personally don't feel like I've ever connected with, in modern politics.
Well, wasn't there the formation of the cooperative, the Farmers Alliance,
Yeah,
that comes up in the railroads, the banks, the oil companies all use their levered power to crush it and just say, outright refuse to do business with anyone uh, in league with the cooperative in a way that completely tilted the scales and, probably led to more of a populist sentiment in the area.
yeah, for sure.
So we have the dad who we get the beautiful portrait. I'm totally with you. We should do like a spin out and get like a proper like historian of that period and that those movements just come, we could geek out on some populism of the period, but like you have dad who's steeped in it, families and sort of on the terrain of front porch talking. This might have been a thing you could continue to talk about. And then this vision of like, what are available resources that LBJ could have picked up if he's trying to get somewhere. And we haven't seen even a little bit of him as the teenager imbibing that populism as a potential strategy, I think, right? He doesn't show signs of it yet.
There's an interesting just cameo as an aside here too with Wright Patman shows up as a in the Texas legislature, I think with the dad, and then they allude to the fact that he'll be in Congress with LBJ. And he was I mean, most people have heard of the Sherman Antitrust Act. There was also the Robinson Patman Act, um, which he was one of the named sponsors of, which was designed to protect like smaller businesses kind of from price discrimination from large manufacturers and suppliers. So kind of an actual policy response. I mean, obviously decades later, but just wanted to interject that because you see this like whole milieu of people who are kind of obviously working on these types of issues in that, you know, even to the extent of someone else who's a personal friend of the family.
You get that other one piece too, that blue sky legislation that looks something like a kind of investor protection sort of piece of legislation, right? Like because of all the oil speculations. That seemed also like a very progressive and interestingly progressive in that it wasn't like a condition to protect the laborer, you know, where we may think of that as class politics in the present, but it was about protecting investors, you know, sort of capital allocation protection. You know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think my big takeaway is like just he's like harvesting all these perspectives and potential paths forward to build his persona and add to his playbook for the future. Like that was my takeaway of those introductions to the story.
Right on. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So we've gathered all the pieces, right? The trap has been set. Many people have not been able to escape, and including his family. And if you don't escape, you can go down farther and end up with a spoiled reputation. And any of the little resentments that the people who felt you were standing out too much had will come screaming back and get you, as the kind of last bits of the piece tell us. His parents end their period and that like having a hard time getting sympathy from people around them for these little slights. And so there's some danger to not getting out of the pot. There's not a guarantee that the safety net works as a kind of social fabric either. And so you got no reason to stay, I think, right? Like Caro hasn't given us any positive versions of what it's like to stay in this place at all. Which is pretty bleak. And so I think, moving into the second part, the escape, like, are there questions that we would want to tee up for each other so that we have them in mind as we make this kind of transformation across the line towards the escaping figure? Things we don't want to drop. Why president feels like it should last. Like, why? I think you can do anything. So why that one, right? Feels like it's got to stay. That's the ultimate question.
Your comments just now on his parents like dying with very little social capital, I think maybe that educates the community capitalism, that like him vote counting, him knowing exactly who's where, who owes him what down to the penny, becomes very, very front and center later on.
I guess I'd also be interested just in terms of how his relation would, because I mean, I think he's representing this area as his district, at least it's part of his district. How his kind of relationship with the people there is the same or different from, either how they viewed him when he was younger or how they viewed his father. I'm sure he gets some benefit by having like father who is an elected political figure, but obviously he's a different man in a way. And so kind of seeing his transition within the community as someone who's their representative would be interesting as well.
The transition into representation, rolling up the area into something you have to stand for, and the other things we'd want to pay attention to for each other. Okay, sorry, I thought I heard Marcus background stuff, right? Okay. I think for me, I'm still really obsessed with how somebody puts a book like this together. So like the so muchness mixed with the selection of details is something like I'm just very curious about as a craft, and trying to follow like the tailoring of that setup. I want to know, like, how did he do it? Like, and what about that feels useful, or how would I say, like a challenge to the standards of evidence and argument that operate as a reader in the present. Like, does this still work for me? Do I want something else? What do I feel when there's a synthesis of facts coming forward, but yet that feeling that it's filtered in some way, right? Like I'm always kind of watching that reaction in the self, in terms of thinking about history, and also thinking about what's going to be proposed as a playbook. How aware were these figures that they were also working the kind of cultural matrix like that, selectively, amplifying the poverty story, or painting, edging the, as everyone does, right? So just like, and where does the biographer take some stolen valor from that, and like lean into too much to sympathy for it? Or where do they make the contrast, like this kind of weird relationship between what it's like to be like a great man book writer, like makes a certain kind of author who can also borrow a lot of that muscularness of the accomplishments in the world. And so I'm just very curious about that kind of stuff. If anybody notices things, I'm always
there's
here.
like a sickliness that sticks with him, but then you've got his nickname Bull Johnson. It comes from bullshit, but you kind of get the sense like that's just strength, but he's almost living in like contrast to his physical self, like his demeanor and his drive compared to what his body is willing to put up with, like, is a common through line throughout.
It's a great one.
I'm personally kind of interested. I don't know if this will go into it, but so far always kind of relations, like for ones with the older woman, like it was, they view him as so pathetic, they kind of take pity on him. And then with his family, it's kind of dominating, especially his siblings and cousins, and mock kind of defying his father. And so I'm kind of wondering if he'll have any more even relationships, ones that aren't kind of in a hierarchy, like where, like I'm kind of interested to see whether he'll have some aspect of himself where he'll be comrades with someone, when he'll go into these things where he'll be able to view someone as an equal to him, as opposed to a strict like hierarchical structure, or if he's kind of not deformed in thinking, but just has some weird
like
quirk.
an actual friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of transactional. Yeah. That's
It doesn't seem part of his personality, though. He seems to think that he needs to come out the better, even where he compromises, that he gets something he wants, even when he makes a deal.
There's no lessons for the present in this at all. Awesome. All right. Well, I think, is there any other final thoughts? We have like 1 minute just to make sure we get them in.
I had just the last sentence or last paragraph of the trap there, where I like that Caro talked about how his parents really wanted to kind of have him stick to the ideals of principle, and I like that aspect of maybe for the next reading. I don't think there's going to be much principle coming out of LBJ, but I think as a young boy, he got to experience a lot of that with his father, the legislator, and the way his mother behaved with the teaching and the volunteering and so forth, and what she did at the household at times. So I want to have a little bit of hope, and maybe I can see a little bit of sprinkles of principle somewhere. But that's all I got.
Awesome. Principles are good. John, did you? Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to, in terms of things to watch out for, things to be thinking about as we move forward, then back to the part of the story that Trey was talking about, where I'm going to be watching out for Caro's storytelling, like this whole 2 years in California on page 124. Strictly speaking, he describes it in LBJ's words, but I, as the reader, just thought that's what happened. And then it's a page, and then 3 pages later, before Caro sets the record straight. And then I had to go back and write liar, liar on the page. I think I'm going to be writing liar, liar a lot, but I was surprised that of the gap, that it was a couple of pages before I knew that. And again, rereading it just now, fair enough. He does put it in LBJ's words, but I'll be watching for that. It's not I'm not going to stop reading just because, he told a good story, but I was surprised that he made the reader wait to find out that we weren't really reading the truth. So we'll see how much that happens.
Yeah, that's keep an eye out for that, like the principal line versus the story and how he gets there. Like that over the whole thing really impressed me and was an interesting one to keep an eye on.
I guess for me, this might be well known by people, but I was reading this the first time now, really struck by how like literary it is, and he has a lot of like beautiful poetic prose. So in some ways that's really impressive. But then also some of his devices, I guess, also make me kind of your point, Erica, about like his type of historiography. It's kind of like these dramatic jumps, and he'll like start a section with a one-line paragraph or one sentence paragraph that basically tells you the conclusion and his interpretation for like what he's about to lay out next, which again kind of makes an exciting kind of read as a story, but also feels like a little unfair as history.
A lot of historians will just they'll save everything that lets them come through as the narrator to the back chapter of the book, and so often with histories you're like boring, 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 and then you get to the back and you're like, oh, like that, worth the build, just as a convention. I'm not sure it makes us any more or less honest, but it is something that he's really bucking the trend of, to make it work.
Yeah, these thick of books, like if you tried to pull that, I wouldn't have made it. Yeah.
Right, totally. Awesome. Yep. Historiography or hagiography or both are all histories flirting with that, maybe even. Well, we will see each other in about a month, right? In the meantime, if stuff comes up, let me know. I'll send notes back your way, and I'll see if I can find us a populist just in case we have questions and we want someone with like the bona fides to give us any more insight on that period. And if other things like that come up, please let me know. I'm happy to hunt people down and see if they'll give us 10 minutes of their time or 15 minutes to answer questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Yeah,
Cool.
thank
See you all
you.
next month.
Thank you. Sorry, Trey.
I would just say I was reminded of a family book I'd read years ago, and apparently, it had like the second chapter is titled Texas Ho, because it's basically about 11 brothers who went from Georgia and Alabama to Texas. And I was Googling the names, and I kind of like was tuning in and out, but ended up from on the East Texas line throughout the hill country. But in doing so, I was looking at it, and the whole thing about the mother having the only college degree in the county, I was like, most of these people at least I'm reading about, were all around that area and had college degrees. So now I'm a little wondering about that. But still, it was in line, I guess, with the people that just went out there and just were going to make it work.
Right on. Thank you. Have a fantastic day wherever you are. Happy Father's Day again to everyone, really, one way or another.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.